Next up is Keith Reynolds, Columbia Institute Research Associate on Public Ownership of Public Services. Keith.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be speaking broadly on public ownership of public services, but I think more importantly, I'm going to be speaking today on what we get to know about services that are not delivered publicly. One of the big issues we've had in Canada and around the last 30 years has been about how public services were going to be delivered. And for much of that time, there was a steady drumbeat of information that, in fact, services had to be delivered by the private sector. That was an article of faith from Gordon Campbell and from Mike Harris and from Stephen Harper. We heard that relentlessly. It was an issue then. It's going to continue to be an issue. Now, there's a lot of evidence, and there's growing evidence that, in fact, that is not true. There's been some recent, particularly damning reports that have come out from the Auditor General in the UK, from auditors in Europe, and Auditor Generals across Canada, that handing the delivery of your services over to the private sector wasn't really a very good idea. Now, it would take me more than 10 minutes to talk about that, and I'm not going to, so just for the next 8 minutes, I'm going to ask you to just trust me on that, and if you want to talk to me about it further, I'll be around here afterwards. The emerging issue I'm going to talk about today is where are we going in terms of the delivery of public services in British Columbia. Just in general terms, the Auditor General of Ontario, I think, spoke particularly eloquently in 2015 when she said, "Government has changed the way it delivers public services. Increasingly, services are outsourced or delivered by public-private partnerships, arm's-length agencies, delegated administrative authorities, self-funded agencies, or other service delivery models." We heard about that going back a long time in British Columbia. In fact, it was in 2004 that our Ombudsman said, "Government has undergone restructuring and services previously provided by government agencies under the jurisdiction of the Ombudsman are now being provided through contract by non-government agencies or new agencies created by statute." So then, what happened over the last 20 years in British Columbia? Well, we saw it happen in a number of different ways. The primary privatization agency in the province was Partnerships BC. And over that period of time, they've developed somewhere in the area of 35 long-term public-private partnership contracts worth billions of dollars for things like roads, bridges, a lot of hospitals, and a lot of other things. BC Hydro was told that they had to make their purchases from independent power projects, that they weren't allowed to develop such things themselves, and the cost has been tremendous. We've handed management of our health information systems over to private corporations. But there has been an ebb and flow. The tide comes in and the tide goes out. When it was coming in, at the turn of the century, we had a government in British Columbia that told the hospital board that they had to accept a public-private partnership for the Abbotsford Hospital or they would be fired. Here in the Lower Mainland, again, we were told that there would be absolutely no funding for the Canada Line from the provincial government unless they delivered it as a public-private partnership. Municipalities in 2006 were told by Premier Campbell that if they had any projects with financial participation from the provincial government, the Partnerships BC got to be the judge, jury, and executioner as to how those projects were going to be delivered. At the federal level, the Harper Conservatives brought in a P3 screen for their delivery of infrastructure funding. But the tide also goes out, and thanks to changing economic conditions at the end of the last decade, and also, interestingly enough, largely because of opposition from the construction industry in British Columbia, there was pushback, and in fact, Partnerships BC had its wings clipped somewhat in recent years. They are no longer allowed to just completely impose themselves on municipalities. When the federal Liberals got elected, they did away with the P3 screen, and that was seen as a tremendous and important change. So where are we going now? Well, there's been two big changes, two really important changes. The first one, of course, is the election of a new government here in British Columbia. The second one is the federal Liberal decision to create a Canada Infrastructure Bank. Now, the Canada Infrastructure Bank was specifically created to encourage private sector, private corporation participation in the funding and management of public services. They wanted money from banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and other long-term investors, and it meant in many cases as much as full privatization. We're still seeing how that develops. But they have $35 billion to drive that agenda. Under the legislation that created the Canada Infrastructure Bank, they probably have the most restriction on the release of public information that we've seen in almost any organization, any public organization in Canada. And that was the subject of this paper by the Columbia Institute that talked about the damage to public information about what government was doing. The decisions that are made, the final decisions that are made about what is going to be funded by the Canada Infrastructure Bank are going to be made by Cabinet. Freedom of information specifically rules out the release of any information from Cabinet or Cabinet committees. It's going to be a black hole of secrecy. What does it mean here in British Columbia? Well, I had a Freedom of Information request into the Canada Infrastructure Bank. They didn't respond. Well, I also had a Freedom of Information request into TransLink. In 2016, in October, TransLink created a briefing note about the possibility of funding from the CIB for a new Patel Bridge. What they said was it was a milestone for the introduction of mobility pricing, because the infrastructure bank is looking for ways to get cash flows into these private companies. Now, that project was then taken off the table because, at least I believe it was taken off the table because the provincial government took it over. In 2017, in February, TransLink talked about the need to coordinate the province's Transportation Investment Corporation, to coordinate with them about CIB funding. And then last November, there was another paper from TransLink, and it said the CIB appears to perceive transit fare revenue as a natural fit in their emphasis on a revenue stream. Now that we have CIB board members here in British Columbia, including Jane Bird, who was involved with the Canada Line P3, we can talk to, and they are sharpening their focus. It may be worth our while to explore the Surrey-Newton-Guildford LRT a bit more as a potential candidate project for a CIB portfolio. So clearly the CIB is looking at infrastructure here in British Columbia, and some of the agencies are looking back. Where does the provincial government stand on this? Well, the fact is, at this stage of the game, we don't know. On the one hand, they've taken important steps like ending the requirement that BC Hydro use the incredibly expensive independent power projects. On the other hand, they have decided to proceed with a couple of public health, public-private partnerships, which I think could have probably been stopped. They were in the process of going forward, but I think they could have probably been stopped. Now, I understand that every speech is supposed to have a call to action, so here's mine. Overall, I don't think that many of these projects to pay private corporations to deliver our services are a very good idea. But one of the reasons in particular that they're not a good idea is because they're riddled with secrecy. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But there are some things that we could do about that. In some jurisdictions, believe it or not, private corporations that deliver public service are subject to freedom of information. Now, right now, British Columbia is having a consultation on changing our freedom of information rules. And they're asking people to tell them what they think. A number of organizations, including the Columbia Institute, if you look at the papers on your table, are calling for those private corporations that deliver public services to be subject to freedom of information, at least to the degree that they deliver those public services. I'd like to particularly encourage you and your organizations to take a stand that says that we should do that. But I would also encourage you to go further. The freedom of information system in British Columbia is broken. People are being given charges of tens of thousands of dollars to provide information. People like the Penticton Herald are having to go to court and spend a lot of money, which small city newspapers don't have, in order to get information. Something needs to be done. Now, there's an indication that the provincial government is willing to do something. They made some very important commitments in the last election in response to a survey from the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. The story goes that back in the 1940s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt once met with a group of activists who were saying they wanted bold action. At the end of the discussion, Roosevelt said to them, "You've convinced me, now go and make me do it." If we want bold action, I encourage you, it's time to go and make me do it.